Westerners make the mistake very often of thinking that people from the Middle East, whether they're Arabs or Iranians or whatever, think like we do and have the logic that we have. They don't have the logic that we have. And I think, for example, we would never consider initiating nuclear use against, let's say, Russia, knowing that if we did, we would lose a huge amount of our own population. And they would therefore say, well, Iran doesn't really intend to use these nuclear weapons. But the Iranian leadership thought differently. They felt it would be worth the death of tens, even hundreds of thousands of their own people in retaliation if they fired nuclear missiles at Israel. So it's a different kind of thinking, and it's not the kind of thinking that many people in the West really understand, unfortunately.
As we're speaking right now, Israel is in the middle of a direct war with Iran. For decades, this was described as a shadow war, covert operations, cyber attacks, proxy battles across the Middle East. But now it's no longer in the shadows. Missiles are flying across the region. Iran's leadership has been targeted. Hezbollah is threatening escalation, and the world is watching to see whether this conflict becomes a regional war or something even bigger. Joining me today is Colonel Richard Kemp, former British Army commander in Afghanistan and one of the most outspoken military voices defending Israel's right to defend itself. Colonel Kemp, thank you for joining me once again.
It's my pleasure.
Colonel Kemp, Israel and Iran have fought a shadow war for decades. Now it's out in the open. How historic is this moment?
Well, the shadow war actually also emerged into the open in June last year when we had the 12-day war after Iran directly attacked Israel. But this is a different proposition altogether. The idea last time was really to take care of Iran's nuclear capabilities and destroy some of its ballistic missile capabilities. This time it seems to be both the continuation of both of those things, particularly the ballistic missiles, but also ending the regime in Iran. Now, I don't think that's specifically an objective of this current war, but it certainly would be a welcome element of it. This war really opens the gates to the Iranian people, weakens the regime dramatically, and hopefully enables them to take over the country from the oppressors that have been there for nearly half a century.
Do you think that, this war was inevitable? Many people feared this war for years. They say that Israel dragged the United States into the war. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I suspect anybody who thinks that President Trump can be dragged into doing anything he doesn't want to do is probably pretty naive or haven't been following what's going on in the world. Israel did not drag the US into this war. Israel obviously needed to have this war because Iran has been the center of the jihadist efforts to annihilate Israel for many years now, and the main sponsor of some of the most dangerous terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah, the Houthis, and others. So Israel certainly needed this war to happen, but the US needed it to happen as well. It's in US interests to deal with Iran, to prevent Iran's aggression around the region, for a couple of reasons. Particularly, there are others as well, but particularly the continued threat of Iran developing nuclear weapons, which wasn't going to go away while this regime was in power. And secondly, the violence and the aggression that Iran showed all around the region and beyond the region, which really left the US with the requirement to maintain significant forces either in the region or ready to deploy to the region. This now, hopefully, depending on the outcome of the war, this hopefully will change that situation completely and free up the US, particularly free up US military resources to deal with the other major problem in the world today, which of course is China.
Yeah. Does it surprise you at all that the regime is shooting at 13 different countries around them, many Arab countries? We know that it's expected for them to attack Israel, but the other countries, were you surprised to see that?
I wouldn't say I was surprised, and indeed, Ayatollah Khomeini, before his demise, before this war began, said he would create a global or certainly a regional war if the United States and Israel attacked. So he announced that as his policy, and it was pretty, I think, inevitable that he would lash out and his successors would lash out in the way that they have, as you say, against 12 or 13 different countries in the region, including a country that's a member of the European Union, Cyprus, and also Britain, which is not a member of the European Union, but has a sovereign base on Cyprus. And I think they their judgment was probably based on two things. First of all, to put sufficient pressure on countries in the Middle East that in turn they would pressure the United States and Israel to stop this campaign. That was probably their primary kind of logical intention, a slightly less logical intention, but one that I think those who understand the Middle East will also understand, which is even though Iran is vastly outgunned by Israel and the United States, and now, of course, by some of the other Middle Eastern countries that Iran has attacked, everything is a matter of honor with them. And it is a matter of honor to fire back, to lash out, even if maybe you realize you're not going to win in the end, you still have to do something. Iran was humiliated by the destruction of its proxies in the region by Israel, by the severe destruction that it suffered during the 12-day war last year, and also by, particularly, I think, in that war, by the degradation of its nuclear capabilities, which was a kind of flagship project for Iran. So it had to, in a sense of honor, it had to do something significant, and it has done something significant. Unfortunately, despite both of those rationales, they were deeply flawed because now they've turned pretty much the entire Middle East against them, including some countries that were on their side or that hadn't shown any animosity towards Iran in the past. So it's a failed strategy, and it's continuing to fail, and it's not going to be maintained because every day Israel and the United States write down Iran's capability of firing missiles and lashing out. They've sunk the Iranian Navy almost completely. There's no sign really of the Iranian Air Force. Their missile capability is being eroded. And I think the commander of US CENTCOM said yesterday that that there are now, in the fourth or fifth day of the war, there are 90% fewer missiles being fired out of Iran than there were at the start.
Now, what kind of regime is the Islamic Republic of Iran from a military and strategic standpoint? Some people would describe them as a paper tiger. They made themselves bigger than what they really were. But what were they and what are they now?
I think I wouldn't describe them myself as a paper tiger. I think their entire strategy, they recognize their military weakness compared to the US and Israel. I don't say they openly admitted that, but I think they knew that was the reality. And therefore, they were at all costs trying to avoid direct conflict, direct confrontation with either the US or with Israel. And therefore, they used their primary military philosophy was to use proxies, and including Hamas, Hezbollah, and the others in the region, in order to have a degree of deniability, which wasn't very, it was pretty flimsy, given that it's not difficult to track who is supporting who and funding and arming who. But this strategy sort of kind of worked in a way up to a point, because it enabled Iran to deliver military aggression as far afield as places like Argentina and Europe, and indeed in the United States, without being attacked themselves. That, of course, fell apart when they attempted to annihilate Israel on the 12th of October, 2023, on the 7th of October, I beg your pardon, 2023. And the result of that, we're really seeing the result of that today, but the immediate result was the destruction, largely the destruction of Hamas, not finishing off, similarly Hezbollah. And some of the other proxies, like the Houthis, were very badly damaged by Israel and to an extent by the US. But essentially, they had no choice really other than in June last year, they had no choice other than to put the bit between their own teeth and carry out their own attack, because there was nothing coming from their proxies. So that strategy, that was what they were intending to do, and it failed.
Now, you have other Arab countries, other Islamic countries that are allies of Israel, or they have ties with Israel. But why has the Iranian regime been so obsessed with destroying Israel, more so than all the other countries around them? And do Western governments fully understand the ideological nature of this regime?
Firstly, I think many Arab countries sought the destruction of Israel from really 1948 when it was recreated. Pretty much the whole Middle East was against Israel. But over time, as a number of wars were fought and the Arab countries realized they were not going to achieve their goals through military force, they gradually came round to reason. And at the same time, particularly I think in the wake of 9/11, they realized that it was a losing strategy to continue supporting global jihad. And many of those countries have turned their back on global jihad and indeed have been trying to suppress that when it's emerged in their own countries. Iran took a different perspective. Iran saw itself as effectively the defenders of Islam, and the leaders of Islam, and Islam requires, under Islamic doctrine, any nation that has ever been ruled by Islam can never again be ruled by infidels, i.e. non-Islam. And it's not just something they don't want to happen, it's their Islamic duty to destroy any subsequent regime. And of course, the land of Israel was once part of the Caliphate of the Ottomans, which was obviously Islamic. And so they had to get it back. They had to take it back. It was their religious duty. And it also gave them prominence in the Islamic world, particularly among the more extreme Muslims who followed this line. They decided to do that initially using, as I said, using proxies, but then at the same time developing nuclear weapons, which I'm certain would have used had they been allowed to continue developing them in a final act of destruction against Israel. That was their real intention. As to whether the Western world understands or sees Iran for what it really is, I think they probably didn't, and they probably still don't in many cases. Westerners make the mistake very often of thinking that people from the Middle East, whether they're Arabs or Iranians or whatever, think like we do and have the logic that we have. They don't have the logic that we have. And I think, for example, we would never consider initiating nuclear use against, let's say, Russia, knowing that if we wanted to, we would lose a huge amount of our own population. And they would therefore say, well, Iran doesn't really intend to use these nuclear weapons. But the Iranian leadership thought differently. They felt it would be worth the death of tens, even hundreds of thousands of their own people in retaliation if they fired nuclear missiles at Israel. So it's a different kind of thinking, and it's not the kind of thinking that many people in the West really understand, unfortunately.
But you would think that after, the regime killed tens of thousands of their own civilians, that the world would be outraged. But it didn't seem that way. It seemed that more people were concerned about, Palestinians in Gaza and things like that, but they were more they wanted to protect the regime. And there are still, people like Tucker Carlson that want to protect this regime. Why do you think that is? What is your analysis of that?
Well, I think there's a number of rationales behind that, one of which is utter naivety, which is prevalent in many parts of the West among many of these people who are trying to defend Ayatollah Khomeini and his regime. And then there's a very strong anti-Western feeling among many, many people in Europe particularly, and also some in the United States, who see the West as an evil entity in itself, as colonialists of the past, at least, having an evil, vicious history, which they want to bring down. They want to change the way of life in the West. And Iran obviously was quite a good hope for that, or they thought it was. And then you have, particularly in Europe, I think, in countries like the United Kingdom, you've got a very large Muslim population, which has immense influence in European countries, including, as I say, in the UK. And while you might think that Muslims coming to the UK from Pakistan or from the Middle East or wherever would want to embrace our culture and would want to adopt our culture and strengthen our culture. But that's true in many cases, but in many other cases it is not true. The more activist elements of those communities, they want to turn Britain into Pakistan or the Middle East or whatever. They want to do away with Western culture. And they have some pretty strong leaders who support that thinking. And unfortunately, the current government in the UK, and this really applies to a large extent across Western Europe, not Eastern Europe, but Western Europe, those governments feel themselves beholden and are afraid of their Islamic populations. In Britain, the current government has enormous support from Muslim immigrants into the UK and also hard left supporters who are aligned with those immigrants. And that really explains the fear of losing that support, and also the fear of Islamic violence if they try and counter their philosophies. That has led to immense weakness in the UK and France and other countries, to the extent that they turned on their most important ally in the Middle East, Israel, while they were fighting an existential war. And in the case of Britain, they imposed a partial arms embargo. They imposed sanctions on some Israeli politicians, and they recognized a non-existent entity called the State of Palestine. All that was done not to try and benefit Palestinians or anyone else in the Middle East. It was all done with an eye on their own domestic politics, their party politics. I think that really, those things do explain the support that many countries, many individuals certainly in countries, have given to the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Now, we saw an impressive opening strike by Israel and the United States that they struck, many targets inside Iran. They killed the top leadership, including the Ayatollah. From a military perspective, how sophisticated would an operation like that be? And what does it tell us about Israel's intelligence capabilities that they were able to strike so many different targets?
I think the level of sophistication in this conflict is unprecedented. It's the most spectacular military campaign that I've ever seen. And for example, the level of firepower delivered against Iran on the first day by Israel and the US combined exceeded even the shock and awe campaign in Iraq back in 2003. So the immensity of the firepower, but also the precision of the firepower comparatively to back in 2003. Both Israel and the US have developed the capability of delivering precise strikes against specific targets in a way that we haven't really seen before, certainly not on this scale. And the extent to which Israel was able to target individual leaders and groups of leaders in Iran, Israel and the US, I think is unprecedented. And you mentioned Israeli intelligence. I think, since of October 2023, seen the most incredible examples of the sophistication of Israeli intelligence, including in their strikes during the 12-day war, including in the strike on Qatar, and I think and of course against Hamas, where top-level leaders were eliminated at various stages during the campaign. I think most spectacularly was in the pager or bleeper operation against Hezbollah in Lebanon. That was the result of years of preparation and subterfuge by the Iranian intelligence, by the intelligence services, which it certainly shocked Hassan Nasrallah, who was, according to his son, he was really in a state of personal paralysis after that. He couldn't believe it had happened. Plus, on top of that, of course, the devastating ground and air offensives against Hezbollah. And so I think Israeli intelligence is absolutely supreme. I would say US intelligence as well, perhaps not quite so sophisticated in this region. Israel obviously is focused almost entirely in the region. The US has very wide intelligence requirements around the world. But the combination of those two intelligence elements in both Israel and the United States, I think, has been absolutely devastating and extremely impressive. And not only is it, I think, utterly horrifying to Iran, but also people like Vladimir Putin and President Xi in China will be taking note of this. And, I think it forms both the intelligence that enabled it and also the military power that followed, I think will form a pretty significant element of the deterrence against aggression particularly from President Xi towards Taiwan.
You mentioned Russia and China. We would have thought that they are partners with Iran and they would help them in this situation. Does it surprise you that we don't see that at all at this point?
I think they've certainly been helping, both countries have been helping Iran before the 12-day war last year and since the 12-day war last year, but in terms really more of providing intelligence and munitions to help them to fight. But when it comes to open confrontation in support of Iran, obviously we don't know how the war is going to work out. We don't know if one or other of those countries is actually going to intervene. I think it's unlikely, but you can never rule it out. But when it comes to open confrontation against particularly the United States, but also Israel, neither country really wants to get involved in that because I think they recognize the superiority, particularly, in the case of China on the other side of the world and Russia a long way from home. It would be very, very difficult for them to make any significant impact, even if they wanted to. And of course, Russia itself is heavily involved with Ukraine and didn't really even have the capability to help defend Syria when the Assad regime fell, which was a close ally of Russia. So I think those two players are most likely to stay out of this to avoid, I think if nothing else, avoid their own humiliation.
Now, Iran has responded with obviously ballistic missiles and drones. What exactly is their strategy, and is there a way to defend countries from drones?
Yeah, again, Israel and the US both have very effective anti-missile, anti-drone capabilities, and they've been shown. Certainly I'm not sure how many drones have been launched in this war, but in the 12-day war in June last year, the vast majority of Iranian drones that were fired were knocked out of the sky well before they came anywhere near Israel. The vast, I think something like 99% of them or something like that. So those capabilities there, and of course, other countries in the region have their own capabilities, mostly supplied by the United States, against drone attacks and missile attacks, and they've been using them. And the reality is that, yes, some damage has been done by Iranian drones and particularly by their ballistic missiles. But, and I don't really like to say this when I think at least 9 Israelis have been killed in Israel by ballistic missiles. So I don't want to trivialize that at all, but it's been negligible in the overall picture, their effect. And that also includes their effect in other Middle Eastern countries. Yes, of course, they've spread panic by attacking airports and hotels and oil facilities, etc., in the Middle East. But there's no sign whatsoever that Middle Eastern countries are buckling to this. And rather than doing what Iran wanted, which was to get countries like Saudi and the UAE to pressure the US to stop, it's had pretty much the opposite effect. And they're more now, I think, certainly at least considering being on the offensive against Iran rather than just purely defensive.
What does it say that Israel and the United States have air superiority over Iran?
I think there was a great deal of damage done to the Iranian air defenses in June last year in the 12-day war, a great deal of harm done to it. They tried to repair it, and they did repair some of their gaps with the help of China and Russia. But they started off at a big disadvantage in the air, largely as a result of the damage done to the air defenses. And of course, the primary focus of Israel and the US in this campaign, the most significant focus was gaining air superiority over Iran by finishing off their air defense systems. And I don't even know, I may be wrong here, but I'm not aware even that one Iranian aircraft took off. It may have done, but certainly they don't stand much chance of surviving if they do take off, because of course Israel and the US together can easily outgun the whole of the Iranian Air Force put together, and much of that was also destroyed on the ground at the opening stage of this war, some also in the war last June. So that really has given, I think now, the coalition of Israel and the US freedom of action over the skies of Iran. They can do whatever they want with very little risk of being shot down themselves or stopped in any way themselves. So, and that, of course, enables all of the other operations going on, which include obviously hitting the IRGC and destroying many of their facilities, destroying not only ballistic missile launch sites, but also storage sites and other things. And now, I think yesterday, the US and Israel went to what they called phase 2 of this war, which is having dealt with, to a significant extent, Iran's air defenses and their offensive capabilities. They're now focusing more, I think, on missile production sites to make sure that the regime can't easily, even if they survive, can't easily rebuild their air defenses. So I think in modern war, air defenses and air superiority is probably the single most critical thing, which enables whatever else you want to do.
Now, reports suggest that Israel and the United States have already destroyed a large portion of Iran's missile launching capabilities. How significant is that militarily? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's incredibly significant, and it really prevents it really. Given that the nuclear program was largely destroyed last year and has not been able to recover from that sufficiently, their nuclear option is pretty much gone. You could say that doesn't exist anymore, really. I'm not saying there's no enriched uranium in Iran, which will need to be dealt with, that there is, but they don't really any longer have the capability to produce bombs and the nuclear bombs and the ability to launch them. And then the second element, which is as you mentioned, is the ballistic missile launch sites and their drone capabilities. Without those, Iran has really no offensive capability. And when you add to that the fact that most of the Iranian Navy is now makeshift submarines. They're all at the bottom of the sea, including, a U.S. submarine that took out an Iranian warship off the coast of Sri Lanka. So, they're really toothless now in terms of aggression around the region. That does not mean to say that they don't have the continued ability to suppress opposition in their country. They do. That's their last real remaining military asset, is the IRGC and the Basid militia and the other elements of the regime that have been murdering their own people and want to maintain the existence of the regime through suppression and murder of oppositionists. That's again, Israel and the US have been working on that. They've been attacking those elements with significant success, but it's the kind of thing that's very hard to do from the air alone. I think those detailed capabilities have to be dealt with on the ground, ultimately dealt with on the ground. That's assuming that they don't kind of give in, which, there's no real sign. There is a sign of splintering within the regime and within elements of the IRGC, etc. But there is not yet any real sign that they're going to just put their hands up and surrender, as President Trump has demanded. So that really has to be dealt with on the ground, I think, what remains of it. And that's not really a task for the United States or Israel. I think I wouldn't be at all surprised, I have no knowledge of it, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if there aren't Israeli and US special forces on the ground already who will have been working both to destroy in some detail some of these internal capabilities, as well as gaining intelligence, and probably doing what they can to put together significant oppositionist groups who are able to take down the final elements of the regime. As I say, that's speculative, but I'd be surprised if it wasn't going on in some form in the background.
I heard a report that they were trying to arm some Kurdish forces to take over. I don't know if that's true, but how important is that if you don't want Israel and the United States to have boots on the ground? Is it important to arm the forces that are already in Iran that are against the regime?
Well, I think the various disparate Kurdish groups in Iran have come together, and they've openly, publicly signed kind of declarations of unity against the regime among groups that were in competition with each other. I don't know whether the US has or will in some way arm them, but again, I wouldn't be surprised if that hasn't already happened. And then there were reports of Kurdish forces in Iraq who were massing on the border with Iran, presumably in support of their Kurdish fellow Kurds in Iran. The Iraqi Kurds have denied that they are planning to launch operations into Iran, but again, they're pretty well organized and well armed and would have significant capabilities in Iran. And the fact they've denied it doesn't, of course, mean it isn't going to happen. In war, you obviously don't want the enemy to know what you're planning to do. So I think we have to just wait and see how that unfolds. But there's no doubt, again, that the US will be in communication with these Kurdish forces in Iraq, and may well, if and when the time comes, if they do decide to enter and fight against the regime, then the US, I'm sure, and Israel will be right behind them from the air.
Now, Israel has layered systems like the Iron Dome, David Sling, and Arrow. I think they have the laser system. How unique is that defense architecture? And is it ever possible to get 100% of these incoming missiles, or is that an impossibility?
Well, I think we've seen in this conflict, and we saw again in the war last year in June, the vast majority of projectiles aimed at Israel have been taken out either by the Israeli Air Force or by ground air defense systems. But as you rightly say, it's not perfect. It's not 100%. It never can be, in my view, or certainly not. It isn't now, certainly. But they've been supremely effective. If you think back even to some of the more rudimentary and less powerful systems used by Hamas against Israel, and indeed by Hezbollah against Israel, Israel couldn't be 100% effective against them either, though they were to a very large extent effective. But there's no country in the world with the sophistication of air defense systems that Israel has. It's been forced to because of the threat that's surrounded it. So it's unfortunate, but it's put Israel into a position of, I would say, global air defense supremacy. There's no one else can match it. And of course, it's very expensive, and a lot of the costs of Israel's air defense systems have been supported by the United States. as well as by Israel itself. One of the developments that's come out of the last couple of years of war, it was being worked on before, is a laser system rather than kinetic missiles being launched to intercept incoming missiles. The Israelis now have in service lasers, which in many cases do the same job, but much, much more cheaply. I mean, it's something like, $250,000 a shot for Iron Dome. It may be more than that, and it's about $5 a shot maximum for the lasers. So I think, and this is early stages for lasers. I don't think any other country has operational air defense laser systems other than Israel. But this is most definitely the future, because it enables Israel and will enable other countries to take down very cheap but lethal missiles and drones, etc., with even cheaper laser defenses. They're not totally perfect, because, for example, in some weather conditions and light conditions, etc., they become ineffective. So you have to have the backup. But overall, I think that's a great sign for the future of air defenses. Again, puts Israel into a league ahead of everyone else.
Are there other countries that have air defense systems that are even close to Israel's?
I think the United States is probably the closest. Of course, they deploy air defense systems around the world, including in Middle Eastern countries. They have various different, and indeed they've deployed air defense systems and have air defense systems now inside Israel, supporting Israel's efforts. So I would say the next closest is the United States. But other countries now, having seen the evolution of combat in Ukraine with the increased use of both missiles and drones, other countries are scrambling to get on this air defense bandwagon. And for example, both Germany and Cyprus actually recently concluded negotiations to acquire Israeli air defense systems for their own countries. And I know that other European countries are working on this. I think my view is that it's probably going to be, for many of them who are behind the curve on this, it's probably going to be a lot cheaper for them and more effective probably to get on board with Israel and look at purchasing and importing or gaining license to manufacture Israeli air defense systems.
Iran reportedly invested heavily in underground missile bases. Sometimes they call those the missile cities, but analysts say that those systems are actually vulnerable once the launch points are identified. Do you think that Iran overestimated how survivable those facilities would be?
I think so, because as we've discussed before, the capabilities of Israeli and US intelligence to identify these kind of sites and then their ability to destroy them, we've seen. And, the US, of course, has, I think, the most powerful capability of destroying underground capabilities than anyone else in the world. And we saw that again. We saw that in the destruction of nuclear sites last year. We've seen it again in this conflict from both the United States and from Israel. So, if you can identify a location and you then are able to take action to destroy it, then it means it's not irrelevant, but it's all the millions and millions of dollars that would have invested in constructing it really for nothing.
Now, as we spoke about, Iran has spent decades building a network of proxy groups across the Middle East. How dangerous do you think that network still is? We saw that Hezbollah did shoot some rockets at Israel, which Israel responded to. But how dangerous do you think they still are?
Hezbollah is, of course, their main proxy, Iran's main proxy. And they've invested over decades, they've invested huge amounts of money in building up Hezbollah, and particularly in equipping it with at least 150,000. I forget what the current figure or the earlier figure was, but a huge number of missiles. And the whole purpose of Hezbollah's missile capability, and indeed its ground offensive capabilities, which were built up as well, was to either to strike Israel, to preempt and prevent an Israeli or US attack on Iran. That was the whole purpose of it. And in the event of an attack by Israel or the US, then was to retaliate in a devastating way against Israel. And they had missiles that were capable of reaching the entire length and breadth of Israel and would have caused immense damage. But that was put a stop to by Israel. Israel did enormous harm to Hezbollah, both in taking out leaders and taking out military capabilities from the air, on the ground, and as we mentioned before, with the pagers, etc., and the bombs in radios and so on. So Hezbollah really have the capability of doing anything during the 12-day war last June. They were, if you like, the dog that didn't bark. During this war, they fired a few missiles at Israel, and that's with their remaining capability, because they did have their capability dramatically written down over the last 2 years. This time, Israel is now, I think Israel is now at the point, there was a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. Hezbollah breached that ceasefire numerous times. They breached it during this conflict. Hezbollah is now at the point where it's going to finish off Hezbollah, in as much as it can be totally finished off, but certainly do a great deal more damage to Hezbollah. And we've got ground forces and air forces, missile attacks against Hezbollah targets going on now in Lebanon. So that huge investment for one purpose, to deal with the situation today, utterly and totally failed on the part of Iran. Their other major proxy was Hamas, of course, and we know now that Hamas, over a lengthy period of time, Hamas was severely written down and is now pretty much in survival mode in less than 50% of Gaza. And I think the next step probably will be, after this war is stabilized, will be for Israel to move in and finish off Hamas in Gaza as well, because it's, as I said, it's pretty much in survival mode, but if it's allowed to continue like that, it will develop further capabilities, and it will find, maybe demoralized by the destruction of Iran or the severe damage to Iran, but it will find other sponsors as well. It already has Qatar and Turkey behind it, and therefore it needs to be dealt with, I think, soon after this current conflict is finished. You have the Houthis. Again, the Houthis did a lot of damage, particularly to international shipping in the Red Sea and attempting to get to the Suez Canal, and also attacks on both Saudi and UAE in the past, not recently. And the Houthis have said they're going to join in defense of Iran, but to my knowledge, we haven't seen anything out of the Houthis. It may be that they realize that as soon as they open their mouth, it's going to get a fist straight into it from Israel, if no one else, maybe from the US as well. But certainly particularly Israel did a lot of damage to the Houthis the last occasions that they tried to attack Israel. So those three major proxies are, I would say, to an extent at least, are under control. Iran's efforts to build a base of attack against Israel in Syria was totally destroyed, really, when the Assad regime fell, really as a result of Israel's actions in Lebanon particularly, because, of course, the Assad regime relied quite heavily on Hezbollah to keep it afloat, and Iran, and neither succeeded. So therefore, the current regime in Syria, as I read it, doesn't really have any intention of carrying out offensive operations against anyone outside of their own country. They've got more things to contend with inside Syria. And the Iraqi militias, which again, Iran spent a lot of time and effort working on and building up. They've been, throughout this whole conflict, going back to 7th of October 2023, they've been very, very weak and have achieved virtually nothing in the whole of that campaign. So, yeah, the Iranian proxy network, which was designed and funded and armed to put a ring of fire around Israel and destroy Israel, is pretty much, I would say, maybe not entirely, but largely out of the game now.
What do you think victory would look like for Israel in this specific war? What do you think their goals are, and how many of them do you think that they've already accomplished?
I think there's two levels of victory, and the first level is the destruction of Iran's offensive capability, both nuclear and conventional. That would be the first level of victory, and I think they're well on the way to achieving that. But it wouldn't be total victory, because that would be the next level, which would be a change of this regime, and not just a change of the regime, but a change of the regime to be replaced by a regime that had no hostile intention towards Israel or other countries in the Middle East, or indeed the US. Now that's the more difficult goal to achieve. But the reality is, just defanging Iran is not going to be the end of the road, because even if you take the most poisonous teeth out, the regime still has the capability of, the current regime, while it exists, still would have the intent and could develop the capability in the future of replacing the lost capabilities. It might take a long time, but the big difficulty with with that situation is currently all of the stars are aligned for both the destruction of Iran's offensive capability and regime change. All of the stars are aligned with Iran in such a weak position it is now, with President Trump in the White House and with Prime Minister Netanyahu in the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem. In the future, if this regime survives, we may not see those same stars being in alignment. We don't know who's going to take over from Trump in the US. Whoever it might be might have a completely different perspective on this. We don't again know if and when whoever takes over from Netanyahu in the next or even subsequent elections. And I think that means that total victory now really includes taking down this regime now and getting it replaced with a more benign regime. And I think that's certainly possible. I don't think it's certain or guaranteed. And what we could see is a great deal of regime infighting. There's divisions within the regime itself, and also potentially infighting within the oppositionist groups. So we might see a situation where one group or another, and I include in, they're not really oppositionist groups, but the Iranian army is potentially as opposed to the IRGC, is potentially a factor in all this. There is a situation where there could be, I kind of hesitate to use the word orderly, but a relatively orderly transition of power, or we could see a long period of immense violence, death, and destruction inside Iran as different factions fight for their own survival or their own dominance. But ultimately, those would be my two definitions of victory in this conflict.
Now, what is the most dangerous way that this conflict could escalate? Do you think that we could see a full regional war? I mean, we don't see many countries backing Iran. What is your assessment?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, we do have a regional war now, but it is Iran versus everybody else. And if we assume that I'm right, and I could well be wrong, but if you assume I'm right that neither Russia nor China are going to come into the picture, there is no other country really outside the region which is going to, I don't think, get involved in this war if it doesn't have to. And so we're going to, and as I mentioned before, every day Iran capability is reduced. So, Iran doesn't really have the ability to widen this war any further. And its efforts so far have resulted on everyone being opposed to it. No, I don't see this turning into either a regional war or indeed a global conflict, which some people have predicted. I don't really see that happen. Again, in war, anyone who makes a prediction as to how it's going to unfold and what's going to be the outcome is really foolish, because you can't tell. War is probably the least predictable of all organized human activities. But I don't see either, an expansion of this war in the region or even beyond the region. Is Iran alone, Iran isolated, no real allies, no allies that are willing to step in and save it.
Now, apparently they attempted to close, or they threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz. What would that do to the global economy? And do you think that they could even do that anymore?
I think the threats to close the Strait of Hormuz have resulted in significant reduction in oil shipments through the Strait, and consequently have, because people are scared, tanker companies, etc., are scared. And we've seen a significant rise in both oil and gas prices in the world as a result of that. As to their capability of actually achieving it, I think it's pretty limited. There are three primary ways, apart from just threats, of closing the strait. One is by laying mines in the water. Another is by interdiction of tankers, attacks on tankers, etc., seizure of tankers by Iranian ships. Thirdly, by missile attack or drone attack. And as I mentioned before, the Iranian Navy is pretty much underwater now. It doesn't really exist anymore. It doesn't really have the capability to interdict, and nor does it have the capability to lay sea mines either. So those two options, I think, are pretty much out of the equation. I would guess that one of the most significant targeting priorities by Israel and the US was against those missiles that were intended to attack shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. And I don't know, but I would imagine that capability has now been lost to them anyway. So I don't think that the reality of Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz any longer exists. Again, like everything else, could well be wrong. They might have something up their sleeve that none of us know about.
Now, If the United States and Israel had not confronted Iran now, what do you think the world would be facing 5 or 10 years from today? And do you believe that they are effectively fighting a battle that much of the West is not willing to fight?
Yeah, I think if the US and Israel hadn't gone on to the offensive against Iran, both in June last year and now, and I think the two are very closely linked, then Iran would have continued and probably accelerated its development of ballistic missiles. It would also have continued to work on its nuclear weapons program. And Steve Witkoff, the President Trump's negotiator on Iran and everything else it looks like, Steve Witkoff said in his, after the negotiations had ended, he concluded that Iran had the capability to highly enrich uranium to weapons grade level within a matter of days to an extent, and a matter of weeks to have even more. But certainly I think he said, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, I think he said something like they had the ability to build 11 nuclear bombs. And that was on the basis of the information that Iran gave to him and that he got from the International Atomic Energy Agency. So, that was a real threat, which would have been maintained had this not occurred. And Iran is absolutely clear, I think, that they had no intention of surrendering that capability. They breached all of the JCPOA, the Obama nuclear deal. They breached all of the agreements of that and were continuing to do so. So we'd have seen a heavily nuclear and conventionally armed Iran. And the US and Israel in the future would have been they may have found a way to deal with it, but they'd have almost been powerless against a nuclear-armed Iran. We know, for example, in Ukraine, we've seen how European countries and the US, particularly under Biden, lived in fear of Putin's threats to use nuclear weapons. And that accounts for why Ukraine wasn't far more effectively armed and given freedom to use those weapons more liberally in the past. And so that kind of illustrates the dangers of having a nuclear-armed Iran. So I think we can be pretty confident that would have occurred. I think what was the second part of your question?
Do you think that they're fighting a battle that much of the West is unwilling to fight?
Yes, I absolutely do. I don't think, apart from Israel and apart from the United States, I don't think any other country in the West or anywhere in the world would be willing to take on Iran. The West is I'm thinking particularly of Western Europe, they're ingrained with the desire to appease their way out of a problem, to negotiate, reason. Again, as we discussed before, thinking that they're talking to people who think the same way as they do. So, and they have absolutely no political will to risk taking part in any war if they can possibly avoid it. And again, we've seen that with Ukraine. We've seen the timorousness of the West against. Again, and not only that, so I mean that's a matter, I think, more of it than anything else of political will. But the other thing is that these countries don't have the military capability. They really don't. Countries like the UK, France, Germany, other Western European countries have run down their armed forces in both in numbers and in technical sophistication ever since the Cold War, to the extent that now, for example, the United Kingdom, which had its sovereign territory, because Akrotiri in Cyprus is sovereign British territory, albeit it's within Cyprus. We had that attacked deliberately by drones, probably fired by Hezbollah, which is obviously an extension of Iran. We were so desperate not to retaliate against those attacks that our own defense secretary said that this is basically almost random attacks, indiscriminate attacks by Iran oblique Hezbollah, when they clearly weren't. But, it seemed to me that he just did not want to admit that British sovereign territory had been deliberately attacked, which would have put him in a position where he'd have to explain why he wasn't counterattacking. And I think, there wasn't a lot of damage done. The runway was hit. There was no one killed. But nevertheless, it was a deliberate direct attack on British sovereign territory, which merited a response and hasn't had one. Maybe it will. I doubt it, but maybe it will. And the reason for that, the obvious target of a counterattack would be Lebanese Hezbollah. And Britain has the air capability of carrying out airstrikes against Lebanese Hezbollah. But they would be desperate not to do that because it would mean coordination with Israel. And that's the last thing they're willing to do. because, as I've mentioned before, our government is, and this applies in other Western European countries as well, our government is terrified of its anti-Israel electorate and anti-Israel population, the elements of it that are anti-Israel. And so the last thing it wanted to do was to be seen to be coordinating with Israel on any offensive operations whatsoever. And that also accounts for why Britain denied the US the use of the British airbase or American airbase in Britain and an American airbase on British sovereign territory in Diego Garcia, which the Americans asked for, because they didn't want, our government did not want to be seen to facilitate an attack on a Muslim country, exactly for the same reason, because of fear of their own anti-Israel and Islamic populations.
Now, I want to end with one question. I want to get your assessment of the last 2.5 years. I know October 7th, Israel was attacked. Their enemies were at full strength and they bounced back. And here we are, March 6th, 2026. Where do you assess Israel, how they were able to be so resilient to bounce back from that attack and where they are now?
Israel was at, I think, an all-time low, pretty much an all-time low on the 7th of October 2023, when there was a devastating failure of Israeli intelligence and Israeli military defense. Both of them, I don't think anyone disputes the fact that they were devastating failures, but they came back extremely quickly from that. And I think Israel, even before this war began 4 or 5 days ago, whatever it is, Israel had changed the face of the Middle East. It had largely neutralized the threats against it. It had brought onto its side many, many Middle Eastern countries that, had either been neutral or opposed to Israel. One of the major achievements was, apart from the destruction of the various different elements of the Iranian proxy machine that I mentioned, one of the major achievements was bringing down the Assad regime. And of course, Syria had been a base for anti-Israel jihadism for pretty much for a long time. And that was gone. That whole thing was gone. I'm not saying that we're going to be living in a land of milk and honey with the new regime in Syria, but I think it's a very different picture. And the Middle East, as a result of that and Israel's other achievements, has been, I think, completely changed. And Israel very, very significantly strengthened by the removal of many of the threats against it, or the undermining at least of some of them, and by the demonstration of its military and intelligence power, which I think people, anyone who follows these things, absolutely in awe of. And if this war works out the way that we hope it will, with a change of regime in Iran and the defanging of Iran, then that even further changes, is even more dramatic change to the entire picture in the Middle East. And there's one possible downside to all this, and I don't like to be negative in this situation because I think it's overall extremely positive. And that is one of the main reasons why we had the Abraham Accords, which were, of course, supported by Saudi Arabia, even though they didn't join it. One of the main reasons for that was because of Prime Minister Netanyahu's willingness to stand up to Barack Obama when he wanted to strike a deal with Iran, a nuclear deal with Iran. And that was the foundation of the Abraham Accords, in my view. In other words, seeing that America was maybe not willing to defend them, the Arab countries. Indeed, it was seen to be on the other side, on the side of Iran. They then saw, I think, Israel as their major protector and the country that was willing to stand up to Israel's enemies and the Arab countries' enemies. Now, the minor downside might be that now we've seen a show of American strength. And also, I expect we've seen the neutralization of Iran as a threat to Arab countries, which was always their greatest fear. They never feared Israel, or certainly not in recent years. They had a strong fear of Iran. That might take away, to an extent, the inducement for Arab countries to work with Israel and to have normalized relations with Israel. It might do. I don't say it will. My suspicion is that, if anything, the worst thing that's going to happen is that maybe Saudi doesn't join the Abraham Accords, as has been predicted. But I think, recognizing the point I made before about how strong Israel is and how sophisticated Israel is, under the table, all of these countries will continue to work alongside Israel, as they have been doing actually for many years. So I think, as a result of 7th of October and the foolishness of Hamas and the misjudgments of Hamas, Iran, etc., Israel has certainly prevailed and strengthened well beyond its position before. And I'm very optimistic, I would say, for the future of Israel in the region, particularly in terms of its defensive ability, but also economically.
Colonel Kemp, I want to thank you for your time. Really much enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure that our viewers will as well. I want to thank you for always being brutally honest and saying the truth about Israel. It's kind of rare to find somebody that does. So thank you again, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It's a pleasure. All the best to you as well.
Thank you. If you have a 401k or an IRA, please listen. Gold is at record highs. What many people don't know is this: you can move part of your retirement money legally and without tax penalties into physical gold you actually own. Alpha Omega Gold helps you do this through a gold IRA. Your gold is real. It is stored safely. It is in your name. Learn more at ao.gold/stand. Alpha Omega Gold is our sponsor, and they proudly stand with Israel.